There's something about the name cold storage that already puts you in a certain headspace before you even know the story. It sounds sterile, clinical, almost like you're about to step into a place where things were never meant to wake up again. And honestly, that feeling is pretty accurate to what this story is built on. Because what you're dealing with here isn't just another creature feature or another outbreak goes wrong setup that Hollywood has recycled 100 times since the early 2000s. This one, coming from David Koepp's original novel, leans into something more patient, more controlled, and then slowly lets that control rot from the inside out. If you've been around genre cinema long enough, you start noticing how these stories usually behave. They open loud, or they open mysterious.
Cold storage doesn't really do either in a traditional sense. It opens with restraint, like it's waiting for you to catch up, like it already knows the outcome and is kind of watching you figure out how it gets there. The core idea is deceptively simple at first glance. A buried, classified biological threat, something that was contained, stored away, locked down by a government operation that doesn't really exist on paper. The kind of thing that gets labeled in the system as resolved, even when nobody actually believes that word means anything. But the problem with anything that gets stored instead of destroyed is that storage implies future access, and that's where everything starts slipping. Now, depending on how you first encounter cold storage, whether through the novel or through early promotional material or concept discussions, the tone feels like it's constantly walking a line between dark comedy and genuine bio-thriller horror. And that balance is tricky, because it can collapse very easily if you push too far in either direction. Too comedic and you lose the tension, too grim and you lose the absurdity that makes the premise so unsettling in the first place. What makes this interesting, at least from a film perspective, is that the threat isn't some abstract virus floating through air like we've seen in pandemic-era storytelling. It's more intentional than that. Almost like it has direction, purpose. Not intelligence in a sci-fi mastermind sense, but something closer to biological inevitability. Once it's loose, it doesn't negotiate. It just continues. And that's where the story starts to feel uncomfortable in a very specific way. Because the first half of anything like this always convinces you that humans are still in control, that containment protocols still matter, that agencies still function the way they're supposed to, that paperwork and sealed doors and codes and authorizations actually mean something when pressure hits. But the deeper you go, the more that illusion collapses. There's a particular kind of storytelling rhythm that films like this rely on, where you start with procedural confidence. You see the systems, the facility, the cold storage units themselves, stacked, monitored, humming with the kind of artificial calm that only machines can maintain. Everything labeled, everything logged, everything supposedly accounted for. And then, almost quietly, something small breaks, not explosively, not dramatically, just enough that one layer of containment becomes questionable. That's usually all it takes. If you think about the broader history of containment horror in cinema, there's always that moment where the audience realizes the real antagonist isn't the creature or the virus or the anomaly. It's the assumption that human systems are stable under stress. That assumption is what gets dismantled here piece by piece. What's interesting about cold storage as a concept is that it doesn't rely on a single location being haunted or compromised. It's not trapped in one lab, one building, one isolated zone. Instead, it plays with the idea that containment is distributed, bureaucratic, scattered across multiple hands that don't fully communicate with each other. That's where the tension comes from. Not just, what is it? But, who knows what? And when did they stop knowing it? And when you start thinking about it like that, the horror isn't just biological anymore. It becomes institutional. Now, if there were a trailer, or at least the kind of conceptual teaser people imagine for this kind of adaptation, it wouldn't open with chaos. It would probably open with silence. Maybe a wide shot of an abandoned facility in a remote cold region, something barely moving in the frame. Wind brushing against metal structures, security lights still blinking even though nobody is there to see them. Then you'd get quick flashes. Not full scenes, just fragments. A containment door sealing shut a fraction too late. A technician pausing mid-report, realizing something in the system doesn't match. A cold storage chamber with frost forming on the inside of glass that shouldn't be warm enough for anything to be active. And then that shift. The subtle realization that whatever was inside didn't stay inside. That's the kind of visual language this story thrives on. It doesn't scream at you. It lingers. It makes you fill in the gaps yourself, which is always more effective when done right. What also stands out is how grounded the premise feels in real-world logistics. We're not dealing with fantasy science here. Everything is built on plausible extensions of actual biocontainment practices, freezer storage, quarantine layers, emergency kill protocols that are designed by people who assume they will never need to be used. That assumption again, it keeps coming back. And the more you sit with it, the more you realize the real tension isn't about whether the organism escapes. It's about how long it's been escaping already without anyone noticing. There's a slow burn dread embedded in that idea that works far better than jump scares or loud reveals. Because by the time something visibly goes wrong, the audience has already been sitting with the possibility that it's been wrong for a while. And that's a different kind of fear. Not, it's happening now, but it might have already happened and we're just catching up. From a filmmaking perspective, if this adaptation stays true to the tone of Keep's writing style, you'd expect a lot of controlled pacing, almost surgical scene construction, moments of dark humor breaking tension at exactly the wrong time, which somehow makes it even worse. Characters who are competent enough to make you trust them, but not competent enough to survive the full weight of what they've inherited. And that's where the human element really starts to matter. Because stories like this only work when the people inside them feel like they belong to a functioning world before everything breaks. If everyone starts panicking from the beginning, there's no contrast. But if you build a world where procedures are followed, where decisions are rational, where leadership believes in its own structure, then the collapse feels earned. And in cold storage, that collapse doesn't feel like a single moment. It feels like a series of small corrections that arrive too late. By the time you recognize the pattern, you're already past the point of containment. And that's probably the most unsettling thing about it. Not the creature, not the outbreak, not even the scale of what happens. It's the realization that everything was technically working, right up until it wasn't. And once that idea settles in, everything that follows feels less like a disaster and more like an accounting error that got out of hand in the worst possible way. That's where this story hooks you, at least in theory. Not with spectacle first, but with the quiet erosion of confidence in systems we rely on without thinking. And once that erosion starts, it doesn't really stop. It usually starts with something that feels almost irrelevant. That's the strange part about this whole story when you really sit with it. There's no thunderclap moment where the world changes direction in an instant. Instead, it behaves like a chain reaction that was already in motion long before anyone noticed the first link moving. In the middle of it sits this forgotten facility in Oklahoma, the kind of place you'd drive past without ever questioning what's inside, because the exterior doesn't ask to be questioned. Flat land, long stretches of highway, structures that look more like storage warehouses than anything remotely scientific or dangerous, and that's intentional. The less interesting it looks, the better it works. Inside one of those controlled environments, something is being kept alive without anyone fully agreeing that it should still be alive, not in the sense of a pet or a specimen in a clean glass case, but something far more uncomfortable than that. A biological threat that was once active, once catastrophic in its own way, and then contained. Not destroyed, not eradicated, just frozen into compliance, locked in a state where time itself is used as a form of punishment. The logic behind it is almost bureaucratic when you strip everything else away. If you can't safely eliminate it, you store it. If you can't study it without risk, you slow it down. If you can't allow it to exist freely, you suspend it in a condition where it can't do what it was designed to do. But biology doesn't always respect suspension. That's where the story really starts to tilt. There's a character at the center of this, and what makes him interesting isn't some heroic framing or chosen one narrative. It's the fact that he exists in the system rather than outside it. He knows how things are supposed to be labeled, where things are supposed to be logged, how incidents are supposed to be reported so they don't turn into problems that reach higher levels of attention. People like that are usually invisible until something goes wrong. And something does. It begins with inconsistency. That's the word that keeps coming up in different forms. Temperature readings that don't quite align with expectations. Logs that show brief fluctuations that shouldn't be possible in a sealed environment. Nothing dramatic enough to trigger alarms at first glance, but enough to make someone pause long enough to scroll back through the data again. That pause is where everything lives. Because once you start looking twice at something that was supposed to be stable, you've already crossed into a different kind of reality. One where trust in the system is no longer automatic. And systems like this rely heavily on automatic trust. Inside cold storage environments, everything is designed to feel final. Thick insulation, reinforced containment units, layered safety protocols that exist specifically to prevent the idea of failure from being entertained too seriously. The air itself feels regulated, almost artificial in how consistently it behaves. So when something inside that environment begins to behave unpredictably, it doesn't announce itself. It simply creates small contradictions in the data. At first, it's easy to rationalize. Sensors drift, equipment ages, software misreads. There are always explanations available if you want them badly enough. But then, the pattern starts to form. And patterns are harder to ignore than isolated anomalies. What makes this particular setup unsettling is that the threat isn't external. It was already inside from the beginning. It didn't breach containment recently. It has been contained for so long that the idea of it being active again feels almost absurd. Almost. That almost is where the tension builds. Because the organism, or whatever you want to call it at this stage, doesn't behave like something that sleeps in the traditional sense. It behaves like something that waits under conditions that temporarily suppress it. And suppression is not the same as neutralization. There's a difference that becomes very important very quickly. As the situation develops, you start to see how many people are indirectly connected to it without realizing they are. Administrators who signed off on storage protocols years ago and moved on to other projects. Contractors who maintain systems without ever being told the full purpose of what they're maintaining. Oversight committees that assume silence equals stability. It's a layered kind of responsibility, spread thin enough that no single person feels the full weight of it until something forces it back together. And when that happens, it doesn't come as a coordinated response. It comes as confusion. There's a point in the story where communication starts to fracture. Not in a dramatic systems down way, but in a more realistic, frustrating way, where information arrives slightly too late, slightly incomplete, or routed through people who don't fully understand what they're looking at. That's where the CIA element of the story becomes relevant, not as a flashy espionage layer, but as a logistical pressure point. Because once anything biological and classified starts moving beyond its intended containment boundary, it doesn't stay a laboratory issue anymore. It becomes a chain of decisions made under incomplete information, and those decisions tend to stack badly. One of the most interesting things about the narrative is how it handles expertise. Nobody is omniscient. Everyone is operating with partial understanding. The people closest to the organism understand its behavior in controlled environments, but not its implications outside them. The people in administrative control understand risk frameworks, but not biological nuance. And the people who are eventually forced into contact with the situation understand none of it at first. That gap creates tension in a way that feels grounded rather than exaggerated. Because in real systems, especially large bureaucratic ones, knowledge is always fragmented. And fragmentation is exactly what allows something like this to slip. There's a moment where physical containment itself starts to feel less like a guarantee and more like a temporary agreement. Doors are still locked, systems are still active, but the confidence behind them begins to erode as people realize that containment only works if the thing being contained respects the assumptions built into the design. And this organism doesn't necessarily respect those assumptions, not in an intelligent, malicious way, but in a way that feels worse. It simply continues functioning according to its own internal logic, which doesn't care about human classification systems. That's a subtle but important distinction in tone, because it shifts the fear away from monster in a box and toward process that was never fully understood. As pressure builds, you start seeing how the human side of the story reacts in uneven ways. Some people default to procedure, clinging harder to protocols as if repetition can restore control. Others start improvising, making judgment calls that technically violate protocol, but feel necessary in the moment. And then there are those who begin to understand that the system they trusted is not designed for the scenario they're currently in. That realization tends to arrive quietly. No dramatic speech, no revelation music cue. Just a moment where someone reads a report, compares it to reality, and realizes the mismatch is no longer explainable through normal error margins. And once that happens, everything after becomes reactive. What makes cold storage stand out in this kind of setup is that it doesn't rush into chaos. It lets the structure of failure unfold gradually, almost patiently, as if the situation itself is learning how to escape containment, one assumption at a time. Even the organism's behavior, when it becomes visible enough to matter, feels less like aggression and more like continuation. It doesn't need motivation in the traditional sense. It just needs conditions that allow it to operate. And once those conditions exist outside the storage environment, the rest becomes inevitable in a way that no single character can fully stop on their own. The story, at its core, starts asking uncomfortable questions without directly stating them. How much of modern containment is confidence versus actual control? How many systems rely on the belief that failure is statistically unlikely rather than structurally impossible? And what happens when something finally proves that assumption wrong in real time? By the time you start circling those questions, the narrative has already moved past its initial setup. The incident is no longer isolated, the response is no longer contained, and the people involved are no longer dealing with a theoretical risk. They're dealing with consequences that have already started unfolding beyond their ability to fully measure. What starts happening next is where the story really shifts from contained anomaly into something that feels like it's slipping through layers of reality that were never designed to hold it for long periods of time. Because once the first breach is acknowledged, once someone finally says out loud that the system is no longer behaving the way the system is supposed to behave, you can feel the narrative tightening. Not in a fast action way, but in that slow, suffocating realization that every response now is already behind schedule. There's a strange irony in how these facilities are built. Everything is designed for worst-case scenarios, but only the worst-case scenarios they've already imagined. And the problem with imagination in engineering is that it always has limits. You can plan for leaks, contamination, human error, equipment failure, but you rarely plan for the specific way those things overlap when something inside the system is actively exploiting the gaps between them. That's where cold storage really starts to lean into its identity, because the organism, or agent or biological construct, whatever label you feel comfortable with, doesn't need to break anything in a dramatic sense. It just needs enough instability to make containment assumptions invalid, and once those assumptions fail, everything built on top of them starts to lose integrity. What makes this phase so unsettling is how procedural everything still looks on the surface. You still have people issuing orders. You still have teams moving through protocols. You still have containment language being used in reports and briefings as if language itself can stabilize the situation. But underneath that structure, something has already shifted. The facility is no longer in control of the timeline, it's reacting to one. And that difference matters more than anyone wants to admit. There's a point where communication between departments starts to degrade in a very specific way. Not total collapse, but misalignment. Reports contradict each other not because someone is lying, but because they are all describing slightly different versions of a situation that is changing faster than their reporting cycle. That creates a kind of institutional confusion where every update feels outdated the moment it is read, and that's where human judgment starts getting stressed. Some characters double down on verification, demanding more data, more confirmation, more cross-checking, as if certainty is still achievable if they just refine the process enough. Others start prioritizing speed over accuracy, making decisions based on incomplete but urgent information because waiting feels more dangerous than acting. Neither approach fully works. Because the core issue isn't decision-making. It's the fact that the underlying system they are trying to control is no longer stable enough to respond predictably. At this stage, the cold storage environment itself becomes almost symbolic. What was once a controlled, sterile preservation space starts to feel like a pressure chamber. The same insulation that kept things stable now begins to trap uncertainty inside. Every sealed layer that was meant to isolate becomes part of a larger, more complex failure condition. And when that happens, containment stops being about keeping something in and starts becoming about keeping everything else out. But that boundary has already been compromised in small ways that are now accumulating. There's a particular kind of dread that comes from realizing that the situation didn't break all at once. It degraded, incrementally. And every small degradation was rationalized at the time because nothing seemed urgent enough individually to justify escalation. That's how systems fail in the real world too, which is why this part of the story feels uncomfortably grounded. You start to see how long the early warning signs were actually there, buried in data logs, dismissed anomalies, and assumptions that no change meant no problem. But absence of evidence is not the same as evidence of absence, and the organism doesn't need recognition to continue operating. At some point, the response shifts from internal management to external involvement. That's when things become less controlled. Because once outside agencies, oversight bodies, or higher-level command structures enter the situation, you introduce new layers of misunderstanding. Each layer brings authority, but not necessarily clarity. And authority without clarity tends to accelerate decisions that might otherwise have been slowed down for further analysis. There's a subtle tension in how leadership reacts. On paper, everything still looks structured. Emergency protocols are activated. Communication channels are established. Assets are reassigned. But in practice, nobody is fully confident that the information they are acting on is complete. That gap between action and understanding becomes the real pressure point of the narrative. Meanwhile, inside the affected environment, things continue evolving in ways that don't align with initial expectations. The containment space no longer behaves like a static location. It behaves more like an active system responding to disturbance. Temperature regulation becomes less reliable, monitoring becomes less consistent, and physical access points start requiring repeated verification, not because security is failing, but because conditions are changing faster than authentication systems were designed to handle. It's not chaos in the traditional cinematic sense. It's something more clinical, almost administrative. a breakdown that still insists on looking organized from a distance. That's part of what makes it effective, because chaos is easy to recognize. Systemic failure that still looks structured is harder to emotionally categorize, and humans rely heavily on categorization when processing risk. At the center of all this, the biological threat itself continues doing what it was always doing. There's no sense of escalation from its perspective, no dramatic shift in behavior. It's more like it is finally operating under conditions that no longer suppress its full range of function. That's an important distinction, because it removes intention from the equation. It's not plotting. It's not adapting in a strategic sense. It's simply no longer constrained in the way it was before, and that alone is enough to change everything. There's a moment in stories like this where you can almost feel the characters beginning to understand that recovery is no longer the goal. That threshold has been crossed without a clear announcement. What remains is damage control, containment reattempts, and increasingly desperate efforts to prevent further spread of a condition that is already partially outside their control. That realization doesn't always come with dialogue. Sometimes it shows up in silence, in the way people stop suggesting long-term solutions and start focusing entirely on immediate containment geometry, how to isolate zones, how to reroute systems, how to cut off access without understanding the full consequences of doing so. Because every action now carries unknown secondary effects, and unknown secondary effects are where these stories tend to spiral. What's especially interesting about cold storage in this stage is how it reflects a broader anxiety about modern infrastructure. We live in a world that assumes continuity. Power grids, data systems, transportation networks, even scientific containment facilities, all built on the expectation that disruptions are temporary and recoverable. But the story starts asking what happens when disruption isn't temporary, when it becomes the new baseline, when normal operation no longer exists in a recoverable form. At that point, even the language used to describe the situation starts to feel outdated. Terms like containment, incident, breach, or response begin to lose precision because they were all designed for scenarios where resolution is still possible. And here, resolution starts to feel increasingly theoretical. The narrative tension isn't built on explosions or sudden reveals at this point. It's built on accumulation. Every system strain, every delayed report, every incomplete understanding adds another layer of pressure that doesn't release cleanly. And the longer it continues, the more it feels like the story is not about stopping something from spreading, but about deciding how much of the system is still worth saving when full recovery is no longer guaranteed. That's a very different kind of stakes, and it's where the story naturally starts to drift toward consequences rather than control.
At this point in the story, something quietly changes in how you experience the situation alongside the characters. It stops feeling like they're handling an incident and starts feeling like they're inside something that's already outpaced their vocabulary for it. Because the moment containment stops being absolute, everything else becomes interpretation, and interpretation is always weaker than certainty. You can feel that shift in how decisions are made now. Earlier, there was still a sense that someone, somewhere, had a full picture. Even if fragmented, even if delayed, there was the belief that higher authority could assemble a coherent understanding of what was happening. That belief is gone. What replaces it is a kind of operational guesswork dressed up as procedure. Orders still come down the chain, but they arrive with less confidence behind them.
Not because leadership is incompetent, but because the data they rely on is now inherently unstable. Every update is filtered through broken observation points, partial sensor feeds, and human reporting that is itself under stress. So even the best decisions are built on incomplete geometry, and that's where the tension starts to feel more psychological than physical. Inside the facility and its surrounding containment infrastructure, movement becomes more calculated. People don't move freely anymore. They move in response to constraints. Access is restricted not just for safety, but because understanding of safe zones is constantly being rewritten. One corridor is secure in the morning and questionable by afternoon. One lab is cleared, then reflagged, then cleared again as contradictory reports cycle through different verification layers. It creates a sense that the environment itself is losing consistency. And when your environment stops being consistent, your instincts stop trusting it. That's a subtle but powerful shift in tone. Meanwhile, the biological threat continues to behave in a way that resists traditional framing. There's no escalation curve that matches human expectations, no leveling up, no sudden transformation into something symbolic or theatrical. Instead, there is persistence under new conditions. It's almost like watching a system resume function after being artificially paused for a long time. Not aggressive in intention, but uncompromising in effect. And that's what makes it worse for the people trying to contain it. Because negotiation isn't possible with something that isn't making decisions in the human sense. There's a moment where the response teams begin to understand that they are not dealing with a singular problem anymore. They are dealing with multiple layers of exposure, some direct, some indirect, some already outside physical boundaries. And once that realization spreads, priorities begin to fracture. Some focus on total containment, others shift toward localized suppression. Others begin to consider the possibility that full containment is no longer achievable and that the goal has to shift toward limiting downstream impact rather than reversing the event itself. That kind of strategic divergence is where institutional coherence starts to dissolve. Because once there is no shared definition of success, coordination becomes increasingly fragile. At the human level, this is where stress becomes visible in more than just decision-making. It shows up in hesitation, in overcorrection, in small moments where people pause too long before acting, not because they lack training, but because they no longer trust the frame in which their training applies. And hesitation, in environments like this, is expensive. Not in a dramatic sense, but in accumulation. Every delayed action narrows the margin for future correction. The facility itself begins to feel less like a controlled space and more like a network of zones with shifting reliability. Security systems still function, but their outputs are no longer interpreted with full confidence. A green status doesn't feel like reassurance anymore. It feels like an unverified claim that might need cross-checking. That erosion of trust in systems is one of the quieter horrors of the narrative, because it doesn't announce itself as collapse. It arrives as doubt. Outside the immediate containment region, the involvement of external agencies introduces another layer of complexity. Not because they are unprepared, but because they are arriving late into a situation that has already evolved through multiple unseen stages. They are inheriting a problem that has already changed shape several times before they even entered the conversation. And inherited problems are always harder to stabilize than freshly detected ones. There's also a bureaucratic tension that runs underneath everything now. Information control becomes almost as important as physical containment, because once details leak beyond controlled channels, public understanding, or even internal organizational alignment, can become unpredictable. So there is pressure not just to respond, but to manage perception of response. And that dual responsibility creates friction at every level of command. What's interesting is how the organism at the center of all this continues to remain uninterested in those layers of human structure. It doesn't engage with containment protocols. It doesn't respond to escalation logic. It simply operates within the parameters that are now available to it. And those parameters have expanded. That expansion is not portrayed as dramatic transformation. It's more like a door that was previously half closed, finally opening fully without anyone actively opening it. And once that happens, the question is no longer, how did this escape? It becomes how much of it was ever truly contained. That question doesn't get answered directly, but it starts to influence every decision being made. Because if containment was always partially theoretical, then every assumption built on it becomes unstable retroactively. And retroactive instability is one of the hardest things for any system to process in real time. The narrative at this stage becomes less about action sequences and more about cascading reassessment. Each new piece of information forces a reevaluation of earlier assumptions, which in turn invalidates previous decisions, which then requires new decisions under even less certainty. It's a feedback loop of uncertainty. and feedback loops like that rarely stabilize on their own. What keeps the tension alive is the sense that the system is still functioning outwardly. Lights still operate, communication still flows, commands still execute. But internally, the coherence that once made those functions meaningful is deteriorating. It's like watching a machine that still runs, but no longer in sync with the logic that designed it. And at some point, running is no longer proof of control. It's just proof of momentum. That distinction becomes increasingly important as the story pushes forward, because momentum is not the same as direction. And without direction, even successful actions can lead to worsening outcomes. The deeper implication here starts to form around responsibility, not in a moral sense, but in a structural one. Who is actually responsible when a system designed to prevent failure fails in a way that was not explicitly accounted for? Because everyone involved was operating within their defined scope. Everyone followed protocols that were, at the time, considered sufficient, and yet sufficiency proved temporary. That realization hangs over everything without needing to be explicitly stated. And as conditions continue to shift, the story begins preparing for the idea that containment may no longer be a binary condition. It may be something more fluid, more distributed, more dependent on continuous management rather than definitive closure, which, in a way, is more unsettling than a simple breakout scenario, because it implies there is no single moment of victory or failure left to identify, just ongoing management of something that refuses to return to a previous state of simplicity. By the time the situation reaches this point, there's a noticeable change in how everyone inside it starts to think, not out loud, not in official briefings, but in the pauses between sentences, in the way people stop finishing their thoughts the way they used to, because something about the structure they relied on has stopped feeling dependable. And when that happens in an environment built entirely on structured response, even small uncertainties start to feel heavy. The facility still exists in a physical sense, of course. Walls are intact, systems are still running, security protocols still trigger when they're supposed to, but the meaning behind those functions has started to degrade. A locked door doesn't feel like safety anymore. It feels like a question mark that hasn't been answered yet. A containment status report doesn't feel like confirmation. It feels like a snapshot taken too early in a process that hasn't finished revealing itself. That's the kind of psychological shift this stage of the story leans into. Not collapse, not chaos, but reinterpretation. Everything that once meant control now has to be reevaluated through the possibility that control was always conditional. And that realization starts affecting decision-making in subtle but compounding ways. At the operational level, containment teams begin to rely less on standardized procedure and more on situational judgment, which sounds like an improvement on paper, but in reality, it introduces variability into a system that was designed specifically to avoid variability. Because procedure is consistent, judgment is not. And when the stakes involve something biological that doesn't respect human classification systems, inconsistency becomes a risk multiplier. Meanwhile, the organism at the center of everything continues to behave in a way that defies emotional framing. There's no malice you can point to, no intelligence you can negotiate with, no escalation pattern that aligns with human expectations of conflict. It simply exists under new conditions, and those conditions are now broader than they were designed to be. That's the uncomfortable truth everyone is slowly circling around without fully stating it yet, because admitting it outright would require redefining what contained actually means. There's a moment where internal communication begins to fragment, not just in content, but in confidence. Reports start including qualifiers that weren't there before. Words like estimated, unconfirmed, potentially compromised begin appearing more frequently, not because the writers are uncertain by nature, but because certainty itself is no longer available at the same level it used to be. And when language becomes uncertain, coordination becomes fragile. Different teams start operating with slightly different interpretations of the same situation, not because they disagree, but because they are all working from incomplete versions of reality that no longer align perfectly. That misalignment creates friction, even when everyone is trying to cooperate. Outside the immediate facility environment, the involvement of higher-level agencies introduces another layer of pressure. But instead of stabilizing the situation, it adds more directional complexity, because now there are multiple chains of authority trying to converge on a single operational response, each with its own constraints, priorities, and risk thresholds. And convergence under uncertainty rarely produces clean decisions. It produces compromised decisions. And compromise in containment scenarios often means delay. Delay in this context is not neutral. It has weight, because every delay allows whatever is happening inside the system to continue unfolding without correction. And the unfolding doesn't wait for consensus. One of the more unsettling aspects of this stage is how normal everything still looks from certain perspectives. If you were observing from outside without context, you might still see structured operations, coordinated movement, controlled access points, and assume that everything is under management. But inside the system, that appearance is starting to feel like a surface layer over something that is no longer fully synchronized beneath it. That disconnect between appearance and reality is where tension accumulates, because it raises a question nobody wants to fully answer. How long has the surface been the only stable part? The narrative begins to suggest that containment was never a fixed state. It was always an active condition maintained through continuous input, monitoring, adjustment, intervention. And when any part of that input becomes compromised or delayed, the system doesn't immediately fail. It starts to drift, and drift is harder to detect than failure. Failure is visible, drift is gradual, and gradual changes are the easiest to underestimate until they become irreversible. At a certain point, containment strategy shifts from prevention to mitigation. That shift is subtle in language, but significant in implication. It means the focus is no longer on stopping the event from continuing, but on managing how far its effects propagate. And that is a very different kind of objective. Because prevention assumes control over outcome. Mitigation assumes limitation of damage, and once that shift occurs, the emotional tone of the entire operation changes even if no one explicitly acknowledges it. There's also a growing awareness among the personnel that the system they are operating within was designed with assumptions that no longer fully apply. Assumptions about response time, about isolation, effectiveness, about predictability of biological behavior under controlled conditions. All of those assumptions were reasonable at the time of design, but the situation they are facing now is no longer contained within those design parameters, which means every action is being taken in a partially outdated framework, and outdated frameworks produce partial solutions at best. Within the facility, physical conditions begin to reflect this instability in increasingly subtle ways. Monitoring systems still function, but their outputs require more interpretation than before. Alerts still trigger, but their meaning is less clear without cross-referencing multiple systems that don't always agree. Even environmental stability, temperature regulation, air circulation, access control starts to feel less like a fixed baseline and more like something actively being maintained under strain. It creates a sense that the environment is being held together rather than simply operating as intended. And that distinction is important, because holding something together implies effort, and effort implies that without continued input, stability will degrade. The organism itself, meanwhile, remains indifferent to those human distinctions. It does not escalate in ways that are easily categorized. It does not present a single identifiable turning point where everything changes. Instead, it exists within a widening set of conditions that no longer match the original containment logic. And that widening is the real issue, not speed, not aggression, expansion, because expansion without clear boundaries is what makes containment definitions collapse. At this stage, the story begins to quietly shift toward inevitability, not in a dramatic sense, but in a structural one. The sense that every decision now is operating downstream of earlier conditions that cannot be undone, only responded to. And that's where the tension becomes less about stopping an event and more about managing its consequences in real time, while understanding that full reversal is no longer a realistic expectation. It's a different kind of survival narrative at that point. Less about victory, more about limiting the shape of what comes next. What starts to set in now is a kind of operational fatigue that doesn't really show up as exhaustion in the traditional sense, but more like a narrowing of possibilities. People are still working. Systems are still being managed. Reports are still being filed, reviewed, escalated, re-reviewed. But the emotional and strategic bandwidth behind those actions is shrinking. It's as if the entire response structure is slowly learning what it can no longer realistically achieve. And that realization doesn't arrive all at once. It arrives in layers. First, there's the recognition that containment is no longer clean. Then comes the acceptance that containment is no longer absolute. And eventually, there's the uncomfortable understanding that containment might only exist in fragments now, isolated zones where control still holds, surrounded by areas where it doesn't. That fragmentation changes everything about how the situation is approached, because once control is no longer uniform, every decision becomes local rather than global. Each team is effectively managing its own micro-reality, based on the stability of the systems immediately around them. And those micro-realities don't always align. That's where coordination starts to feel strained in a very specific way. Not through conflict, but through divergence. Two groups can both be acting correctly according to their available data, and still be working toward outcomes that don't fully support each other anymore. It's not failure of intelligence, it's failure of shared context. Inside the containment infrastructure, that begins to manifest as shifting priorities. One area might still be focused on preservation of data and samples, another on physical isolation, another on preventing outward spread beyond secondary boundaries. But without a unified baseline, those priorities can start to compete unintentionally. And when priorities compete in a system already under stress, something has to give. There's a growing sense among the personnel that they are no longer reacting to a single problem, but to a chain of consequences that can't be fully separated from each other anymore. Every containment attempt has downstream effects. Every shutdown creates a blind spot. Every intervention introduces a new unknown. So even successful actions come with trade-offs that weren't fully visible at the time of execution. That's one of the most unsettling aspects of this stage of the story. The idea that correctness is no longer cleanly defined. Because in earlier phases, actions could be evaluated against outcomes. Did it work? Did it fail? Did it contain or not contain? Now, those definitions start to blur. An action can work locally while contributing to broader instability elsewhere. A containment measure can succeed in one zone while unintentionally increasing pressure in another. And once that pattern becomes visible, decision-making becomes far more cautious, but also slower. And slowness in this environment is not neutral. It carries its own risks. At the same time, external oversight becomes more intrusive, not necessarily because of mistrust, but because of escalating stakes. Higher-level coordination bodies begin requesting more frequent updates, more granular data, more confirmation of status across multiple zones. But the irony is that the more detailed the requests become, the harder it is to fulfill them accurately. Because granularity doesn't improve clarity when the underlying system is unstable. It just multiplies the number of partially accurate reports. And partial accuracy is dangerous in a situation like this because it creates an illusion of control without guaranteeing actual control. That illusion starts to influence how confidence is distributed across the response structure. Some teams begin to operate as if stability is still recoverable with enough precision. Others begin to assume that stabilization is no longer the primary objective and shift toward limiting exposure and preserving critical infrastructure. Neither approach is explicitly wrong based on the information they have, but they are increasingly incompatible. And incompatibility inside a coordinated response system creates friction even without disagreement. Meanwhile, within the affected zones, the biological threat continues to operate within its expanded set of conditions. There is no sign that it is winning in a conscious sense. It's more accurate to say it is simply no longer constrained by the assumptions that previously defined its limits. And that distinction matters, because it reframes the entire situation away from conflict and toward exposure. Exposure of systems, exposure of assumptions, exposure of how much of the containment architecture depended on ideal conditions rather than persistent resilience. There's a point where personnel begin to realize that many of the systems they trusted most were designed with the expectation that failure would be rare enough to remain manageable, not common enough to require adaptive redesign under stress. And once that realization spreads, It changes how every system output is interpreted. Even stable readings begin to feel provisional. Even secure zones begin to feel temporarily secure. Even resolved incidents begin to feel like they might still be unfolding in ways not yet fully visible. That constant reevaluation creates cognitive strain across the response structure. Not panic, but something more corrosive, uncertainty that cannot be resolved quickly enough to restore confidence before the next update arrives. And that cycle repeats. Information arrives, interpretation happens, decisions are made, new information contradicts or complicates previous understanding. Adjustments follow. And then the cycle begins again, slightly more constrained each time. It gives the impression of movement without progress in a linear sense, like trying to stabilize a shifting surface that keeps changing properties faster than stabilization can be applied. At some level, the story begins to imply that the real crisis is not the organism itself, but the mismatch between system design and emergent complexity. Because everything the response structure is built on assumes that problems can be isolated, defined, and resolved within manageable boundaries. But what they are dealing with now does not stay within boundaries once it begins interacting with them. It adapts to the structure of containment itself simply by existing within it long enough. And that is where the most uncomfortable implication begins to form. Not that the system failed in one moment, but that it may have been gradually outmatched by something it was never fully equipped to model in the first place. And once that idea takes hold, every remaining action starts to feel less like control and more like negotiation with conditions that are already shifting beyond the reach of full understanding. At this point, the story starts to feel less like a contained incident and more like a long exposure photograph of a system slowly losing its original shape. Nothing dramatic changes all at once. That's the part that keeps unsettling everyone involved. Because if there were a single defining moment of collapse, it would be easier to process, easier to isolate, easier to assign responsibility to. Instead, what they're dealing with is something that has already crossed multiple thresholds without ever announcing that it was doing so. And now, those thresholds are only visible in hindsight. Inside the operational structure, there's a shift toward what people start calling adaptive containment, though nobody really says it with confidence. It's more of a placeholder term than a real doctrine. It simply means reacting in real time to conditions that no longer match pre-established protocols, which, in practice, is just another way of saying the protocols no longer fully apply. That realization doesn't hit everyone at once. It filters through different levels of the response hierarchy unevenly. Some personnel still operate as if standard procedure will eventually reassert control. Others have already moved past that assumption and are working in a mode that prioritizes immediate stabilization over procedural correctness. And that divergence creates a quiet tension in coordination. Because when two parts of a system are no longer operating under the same definition of correct, communication becomes less about instruction and more about translation. Every update has to be interpreted through context that may no longer be shared consistently across teams. And translation always introduces drift. The environment itself continues to reflect that instability in increasingly subtle ways. Monitoring systems are still active, but their outputs begin to require constant cross-validation. No single data stream feels sufficient on its own anymore. Temperature, pressure, access logs, biological readings, all of it has to be layered and compared before anyone trusts what it's saying. And even then, trust is provisional. There's a growing awareness that the system is now producing information faster than it can be fully verified. Not because of overload in a traditional sense, but because conditions are changing at a rate that outpaces confirmation cycles. So even accurate readings are effectively outdated by the time they are fully interpreted. That creates a strange temporal disconnect in decision-making. People are no longer reacting to the present. They are reacting to a slightly older version of the present, reconstructed through delayed data. And in high-stakes containment scenarios, that delay becomes structurally significant. Meanwhile, the organism, or the biological system at the center of everything, continues to operate without acknowledging the framework built around it. It does not escalate in a way that matches human expectations of threat behavior. There is no central moment of aggression that redefines the situation. Instead, there is persistence within expanded conditions. It is functioning, not reacting. And that difference becomes increasingly important as the narrative progresses, because reaction implies engagement with external pressure. Function implies continuation, regardless of it. Inside the response structure, that distinction is not immediately obvious. Early interpretations still rely on familiar threat models: containment breach, outbreak expansion, localized escalation. But those models begin to lose precision as more data accumulates. The situation is not behaving like a breach that can be reversed. It is behaving like a system that has already integrated itself into the environment it escaped into. And once that idea starts to take hold, containment begins to feel less like a wall and more like a temporary delay. There's a point where leadership begins to focus less on restoring original containment conditions and more on preventing secondary propagation. That shift is subtle but significant. It acknowledges, even if indirectly, that full restoration may no longer be feasible within acceptable risk margins. So the goal becomes limiting the footprint of what has already occurred, and that reframing changes everything about operational intent. Because once you accept that you cannot return to baseline, every decision becomes about managing deviation rather than eliminating it. At the ground level, personnel begin to feel that shift in the way instructions are delivered. Commands become more conditional. Objectives become more localized. Instead of unified containment goals, there are now layered priorities that differ depending on zone stability and available resources. And that fragmentation introduces a new kind of stress. Not panic, but fragmentation of purpose. People are still doing their jobs, but the larger picture that used to give those jobs meaning is no longer stable enough to fully visualize.
At this stage, the most unsettling part isn't what's happening inside the system anymore. It's how quickly everyone has started adjusting to it. Not adapting in a heroic, we will fix this kind of way, but adapting in the quieter sense, redefining what counts as acceptable functioning under conditions that would have previously been considered unacceptable. That shift happens slowly enough that no one really notices it happening in real time. It's only when someone looks back at earlier protocols, earlier expectations, earlier assumptions about containment integrity that the contrast becomes obvious. What used to be critical failure conditions are now being discussed as managed instability states. And that change in language isn't cosmetic. It reflects a deeper structural recalibration.
Inside the operational environment, the idea of full restoration has essentially stopped being part of active planning. Not because it was formally abandoned, but because every attempt to move toward it introduces more instability than it resolves. Each corrective measure interacts with a system that is no longer responding in predictable ways, and that unpredictability compounds with every intervention. So the system begins to behave as if stabilization itself is the primary objective, not restoration. And stabilization is a very different goal. It doesn't imply return, it implies maintenance. There's a point where leadership stops asking, how do we reverse this? And starts asking, how do we prevent further divergence? That question carries a different emotional weight. It's not about winning or resolving. It's about limiting spread of deviation from a baseline that is already no longer fully intact. And that baseline, once taken for granted, is now treated as a reference point rather than a recoverable state. In practical terms, this changes how every operation is structured. Instead of centralized containment action, there are now layered containment behaviors operating simultaneously across different zones. Some are defensive, some are observational, some are purely diagnostic, designed to understand what is happening without directly altering conditions. But even observation is no longer neutral, because in a system that is actively changing, observation itself becomes part of the feedback loop, and feedback loops are never passive in environments like this. At the ground level, personnel begin to notice that their relationship with information has fundamentally changed. Reports are no longer treated as definitive descriptions of reality. They are treated as snapshots of a system that is already in motion. That means every report comes with an implicit question attached to it. How much has changed since this was recorded? And that question can never be fully answered in real time. So decisions are made under a kind of layered uncertainty. Uncertainty about conditions, uncertainty about timing, uncertainty about whether the system being observed is still operating under the same parameters as the last confirmed measurement. This creates a subtle but constant cognitive strain, not panic, not confusion, something closer to continuous recalibration. Meanwhile, the organism or underlying biological condition continues to exist without reference to the administrative or structural categories imposed upon it. It is no longer meaningful to describe it purely in terms of containment status, because containment status assumes a stable boundary definition that no longer holds consistently across all zones. Instead, what exists is a spectrum of interaction intensity. Areas where influence is minimal, areas where influence is measurable but stable, and areas where influence is actively altering system behavior in ways that cannot be fully isolated without affecting surrounding structures. And that spectrum keeps shifting, which means the map is always slightly out of date. At higher coordination levels, there is an increasing reliance on predictive modeling, but even those models begin to lose precision as variables multiply faster than they can be integrated. The system is not just complex, it is dynamically complex, meaning that the act of measuring it changes the thing being measured in subtle ways. That makes full accuracy structurally unattainable, and once that becomes understood, decision-making shifts again, not toward certainty, but toward bounded tolerance. In other words, instead of asking what is correct, the system begins asking what is acceptable within known uncertainty ranges, and that is a fundamentally different way of operating. There's also a growing recognition that containment infrastructure is no longer functioning as a single protective layer. It is functioning more like a series of pressure points distributed across a network, each absorbing stress independently, but not always communicating that stress effectively to other parts of the system. Which means failures are no longer singular events. They are distributed degradations. And distributed degradation is harder to detect early because it doesn't announce itself through a single point of collapse. It shows up as small inconsistencies spread across multiple systems that only become meaningful when viewed collectively. By the time those patterns are recognized, they are already embedded. At this stage, the emotional tone of the response effort begins to shift as well. There is still professionalism, still structure, still adherence to protocol where possible. But underneath that, there is a growing acceptance that the system is no longer operating within its original design assumptions. And once that acceptance becomes widespread, it changes how people interpret success. Success is no longer containment achieved. It becomes containment maintained within acceptable deviation thresholds. That's a subtle but profound difference, because it means the objective is no longer to eliminate instability, but to live inside it without allowing it to escalate beyond control margins. And that redefinition quietly marks the transition from crisis response to sustained management of a permanently altered system state. At a certain level, the story stops feeling like it is building toward resolution and starts feeling like it is documenting the stabilization of instability itself. And that's where everything now quietly settles, inside a system that is still functioning, still responding, still adapting, but no longer operating under the assumption that it can return to what it once was. At this stage, the story stops pretending there's a clean line between containment event and ongoing condition. That line has already dissolved, even if nobody is officially willing to say it that plainly. What remains is a system still running the language of control while quietly adapting to the reality that control is no longer centralized in any meaningful way. And that mismatch between language and reality is where most of the remaining tension lives. Inside the operational structure, decision-making becomes increasingly modular. Instead of a single coordinated containment strategy, there are now multiple overlapping strategies operating at different levels of authority and different degrees of certainty. Each one is technically valid within its own constraints, but none of them fully account for the total system state anymore. It creates a situation where coherence exists only in fragments, and fragments don't scale well under pressure. Field teams begin operating with what can only be described as bounded autonomy. They are given objectives, but not always full visibility into how those objectives connect to the broader situation. That's not necessarily intentional obfuscation. It's a response to information instability. Too much shared detail risks spreading outdated or contradictory interpretations faster than they can be corrected. So information becomes selective. And selective information always reshapes perception. At the same time, containment infrastructure continues to degrade in a way that is almost imperceptible in isolation, but undeniable when viewed cumulatively. One system failure on its own would be explainable. A delayed sensor response would be trivial. A temporary access inconsistency would be manageable. But together, they begin to form a pattern that no longer feels random. And once pattern recognition kicks in, even neutral anomalies start to feel loaded with meaning. There's a growing awareness that the system is no longer simply responding to a biological entity inside containment. It is responding to a distributed condition that has already interacted with multiple layers of infrastructure, protocols, and assumptions, which means the original point of failure is no longer the only point of concern. It has multiplied, and multiplication of failure points changes the entire response philosophy. Instead of asking, "How do we stop this?" teams begin asking, "How do we prevent further interaction between affected zones and unaffected systems?" That shift is subtle, but defining, because it marks the transition from intervention to separation management. Meanwhile, the organism continues operating under its own logic, which increasingly feels less like behavior and more like continuation of function under expanded conditions. It is not adapting in a strategic sense. It is not evolving in response to human containment efforts. It is simply persisting in a way that no longer respects the boundaries that were originally assumed to constrain it. And that persistence has consequences that are now being measured indirectly through system strain rather than direct observation. because direct observation itself has become increasingly unreliable in certain zones. That unreliability introduces another layer of uncertainty into already fragile decision loops. Leadership structures begin to rely more heavily on probabilistic assessments rather than deterministic reports. Risk is no longer evaluated as binary outcomes, but as ranges of potential instability. And when everything becomes a range instead of a fixed point, decision-making naturally becomes more conservative in some areas and more aggressive in others, depending on how each group interprets acceptable risk thresholds. This divergence creates internal friction, even without explicit disagreement. It's more like different parts of the system slowly drifting into slightly different versions of reality, and those versions are not always compatible. There's a particularly important undercurrent forming now around resource allocation. As containment becomes more fragmented, the question of where to deploy limited stabilization capacity becomes increasingly difficult. Some zones require immediate reinforcement. Others require observation rather than intervention. Still others are in a state where intervention itself may introduce more instability than it resolves. So every allocation decision carries opportunity cost in a way that is no longer abstract. And opportunity cost, in crisis conditions, becomes irreversible very quickly. At the human level, this begins to manifest as a kind of quiet recalibration of expectations. People stop speaking in terms of resolution and start speaking in terms of endurance. How long a zone can hold, how long a system can remain functional under partial compromise, how long coordination can be maintained before fragmentation becomes too significant to manage. Time becomes the central unit of measurement rather than success or failure, because success is no longer clearly defined and failure is already distributed. What makes this phase particularly tense is that outwardly, things still resemble an organized response. There are still structures, hierarchies, protocols, and operational language that suggests control is intact. But internally, everyone involved understands that what they are maintaining is no longer the original system. It is a modified version of it, adapted in real time, under conditions it was never fully designed to accommodate, and that adaptation is ongoing, which means the system is never fully stable long enough to return to a baseline state for reassessment. It is always in transition, and continuous transition without a return point eventually becomes its own kind of permanence. At some level, the story begins to suggest that containment was never a fixed achievement, but a continuous process that only appeared stable because disruption had historically remained within predictable limits. Now those limits are no longer reliable, and once that realization fully settles, every remaining action starts to feel less like control and more like navigation through a system that is still functioning, but no longer behaving in ways that allow for clean prediction or resolution. That's where the narrative tension now rests, not an explosion, not an escalation, but in the slow recognition that the framework itself has shifted beyond its original assumptions, and everything built on those assumptions is now operating in a state of permanent adjustment. At this point, what's left of the response structure feels less like a unified machine and more like a set of overlapping survival instincts trying to remember they were once part of something coherent. Nobody says it that way, of course. In official language, everything is still active containment, ongoing mitigation, controlled stabilization. But inside the actual decision loops, there's a different reality forming. One where every choice is made with the quiet understanding that the system they are protecting is already partially transformed, not destroyed, not fully compromised, transformed. And that word carries a different kind of weight, because transformation implies you are no longer dealing with a recoverable version of the original problem. You are dealing with a new configuration that only resembles the original from a distance. Inside the containment network, this shows up in the way priorities are constantly being rewritten without ever officially resetting anything. It's subtle. No single directive announces a change in doctrine. Instead, you get incremental adjustments, revised thresholds, modified response hierarchies, reclassified risk zones. Each adjustment makes sense on its own, but together, they tell a story of gradual surrender to complexity. One of the most important shifts happening now is that containment is no longer treated as a single objective. It is split into multiple competing objectives that don't always align cleanly. Prevent spread, maintain infrastructure integrity, preserve data and samples, protect external populations, stabilize internal systems long enough to reassess. Each one is valid, each one is urgent, and each one can conflict with the others depending on how conditions change in real time. That conflict is where operational strain accumulates, because when priorities compete, decision latency increases. And when decision latency increases in a dynamic biological situation, the system begins to lag behind its own environment. And lag, once introduced, is very difficult to eliminate. In the field, personnel start relying more heavily on localized interpretation. Instead of waiting for centralized confirmation, teams begin making conditional decisions based on immediate environmental feedback. That's not rebellion, it's adaptation. But it also means that the system is no longer operating as a single coordinated entity. It is operating as a network of semi-independent nodes responding to a shared threat with slightly different understandings of what correct response looks like. And that subtle divergence changes everything, because coordination is no longer guaranteed by structure. It has to be actively maintained under increasingly unstable informational conditions. Meanwhile, the organism at the center of this continues to exist in a way that feels increasingly detached from human categorization. It is no longer useful to think of it as contained or escaped in traditional binary terms. Those categories assume a stable boundary condition that no longer exists in practice. Instead, what exists is interaction. Interaction between biological function and human-built systems that were designed under assumptions of separability. And separability no longer holds cleanly. There are zones where containment still functions in recognizable form. There are zones where it functions partially, and there are zones where containment is effectively a historical label applied to conditions that have already evolved beyond its original definition. This uneven distribution creates a patchwork reality that is extremely difficult to manage from any centralized perspective, because central oversight relies on consistency, and consistency is exactly what is breaking down. At the higher coordination level, leadership begins to shift language in a way that reflects this without fully acknowledging it. Instead of absolute statements, reports increasingly use conditional phrasing. Instead of definitive status updates, they use probability-weighted assessments. Instead of clear containment success metrics, they refer to stability indices that fluctuate depending on how and when data is collected. It's still formal, still structured, but less absolute. And that loss of absoluteness is the real indicator of where things stand. There's also an emerging recognition that the system is now in a state where full visibility is structurally impossible. Not because data is missing, but because the system generating the data is itself changing faster than it can be fully mapped in real time. That means every assessment is, by definition, slightly outdated. And outdated assessments become dangerous when they are used to justify immediate action in a rapidly shifting environment. So the response structure begins to prioritize caution in interpretation while still requiring urgency in execution. And that contradiction creates pressure at every level. Within the facility environment, physical containment systems are still functioning, but their role has shifted. They are no longer definitive barriers. They are now temporal buffers, slowing progression, segmenting exposure, buying time for reassessment cycles that are themselves under strain. It's containment as delay, not containment as prevention. And that distinction quietly redefines the entire operation. There's a growing awareness among the people closest to the situation that the real challenge is no longer stopping a single event. It is managing a cascading set of conditions that were triggered by the original event, but now exist independently enough that they can't be resolved by addressing the source alone. Which leads to a very uncomfortable conclusion that no one formally states. Even if the original organism or source condition were fully neutralized, the system it interacted with would still be in a state that requires ongoing stabilization. That realization changes the emotional tone of the entire response effort, because it removes the idea of a clean endpoint. And without an endpoint, every action becomes part of an indefinite process rather than a finite solution. At that point, the narrative begins to feel less like a crisis story and more like a study of sustained instability under constrained systems, where success is no longer measured by resolution, but by how long coherence can be maintained before fragmentation becomes irreversible. And that question, how long coherence can hold under continuous pressure, is where everything now quietly converges.
At this stage, the situation stops feeling like something that can be solved in any traditional sense, and starts feeling more like something that has to be continuously negotiated with. That's the part nobody really says out loud in the formal structure of the response effort, but it's there in every decision now, in the pacing, in the caution, in the way even confident directives come with implicit acknowledgments of uncertainty embedded inside them. The system hasn't collapsed. That's the strange thing. It's still functioning. It still produces outcomes. It still responds to inputs, but it no longer behaves like a closed problem. It behaves like an open condition. Inside containment operations, that shift has slowly changed the way people think about success. Early on, success meant isolation, keeping the biological threat within defined boundaries, preventing external spread, maintaining structural integrity of containment layers.
Now success is defined more defensively. It means preventing escalation beyond current instability thresholds. It means ensuring that whatever state exists does not expand faster than the system can adapt to it. That's a very different metric, and it quietly redefines everything beneath it. There's a noticeable change in how reports are written at this stage. Earlier language carried a sense of direction, clear objectives, measurable endpoints, expected outcomes. Now, language is more conditional, more layered, often structured around ranges of probability rather than fixed states. You see phrases that imply stability under current variables, or containment within acceptable deviation parameters, or system integrity maintained despite localized compromise. Each of those phrases is technically accurate, but together they form a picture of a system that is no longer stable in the way it was originally designed to be. It's stable in motion, not stable in rest. And that difference is everything. In the field, personnel have adapted in ways that feel almost invisible unless you compare them to earlier stages. They no longer wait for full confirmation cycles before acting in certain situations. They rely more on pattern recognition, on partial data, on experience-based inference when formal verification is too slow to be useful. That kind of adaptation keeps the system functioning, but it also introduces variability. And variability is something containment systems are historically designed to minimize, not accommodate. So what you end up with is a hybrid structure, part protocol, part improvisation, all operating under a shared understanding that the original system logic is no longer fully sufficient on its own. At the same time, the biological condition continues to exist in a way that is increasingly described in systemic rather than isolated terms. It is no longer just inside containment zones in a meaningful sense. It is interacting with containment infrastructure as part of its operational environment, and that interaction is not static. It changes how systems respond, which in turn changes how responses are designed, which then feeds back into how the condition behaves in those environments. It becomes a loop of adaptation without a clear endpoint. That's one of the more unsettling realizations that emerges here. Containment is no longer a barrier between two separate things. It is a shared environment of interaction that both sides are now shaping, even if only one side is conscious of shaping it. Within higher coordination structures, there's a gradual shift toward treating the situation less as an emergency and more as a persistent operational state. That doesn't mean urgency disappears. It means urgency becomes normalized. And normalized urgency is one of the hardest states for any system to sustain over long periods without internal strain, because it removes the distinction between crisis mode and standard mode. Everything becomes continuous pressure management. At some level, leadership begins to accept that full restoration of prior conditions is no longer a realistic planning horizon, not because of defeat, but because of structural transformation. The system they are managing has changed too fundamentally to be returned to its original configuration without introducing further instability elsewhere. And that introduces a different kind of objective, not reversal, not elimination, but long-term stabilization of a system that is already partially redefined. That's where the emotional tone of the entire response effort settles into something quieter but heavier. There is still action. There is still coordination. There is still structured effort to manage conditions. But beneath it all is an understanding that the goal is no longer a return to before. It is containment of what after has already become. And the organism at the center of this no longer functions as an isolated adversary in that framework. It functions as a persistent variable within a system that has already incorporated its presence into its ongoing state dynamics. Which means the story is no longer about stopping something from happening. It is about continuously managing a condition that has already happened and continues to evolve within the structures designed to contain it. And that's where everything now quietly rests, inside a system still operational, still structured, still responsive, but no longer operating under the assumption that it can return to its original form or a fully resolved endpoint. At this point, the most important thing to understand is that the event everyone originally responded to has stopped behaving like an event at all. It's no longer a moment in time you can point to and say, that's when things went wrong. It has become something closer to an environment. And once something becomes an environment, containment stops meaning what it used to mean. Inside the operational structure, that realization shows up in how people talk without fully realizing they've changed their language. Earlier phases were full of action verbs: contain, isolate, neutralize, secure. Now the dominant language is maintenance-based: sustain, stabilize, monitor, limit, reduce exposure. It's a quiet shift, but it reflects something very real underneath it. The system is no longer trying to end the situation. It is trying to exist alongside it without letting it expand beyond certain boundaries. And those boundaries are no longer absolute lines. They are managed thresholds. That distinction is subtle, but it changes everything about how decisions are made. Because thresholds are not fixed. They are constantly reassessed based on current conditions. And that means the system is now operating in a state of permanent recalibration. Within containment infrastructure, this has a very specific effect. Instead of designing for failure prevention, the system is now designed for failure absorption, meaning it assumes that some level of compromise is always present and focuses instead on preventing that compromise from cascading beyond controllable limits. So containment becomes layered rather than binary. You don't have contained versus uncontained anymore. You have gradients of influence, zones of partial stability, regions under conditional control, and areas classified by exposure risk rather than binary status. And once that mapping system replaces the old one, everything starts to feel more complex, even when nothing is actively changing in a dramatic sense. At the operational level, this creates a constant tension between speed and verification. Acting too slowly means allowing conditions to drift further. Acting too quickly means risking decisions based on incomplete or partially outdated data. And there is no perfect resolution to that tension. So the system settles into something that looks like controlled hesitation, fast enough to respond, slow enough to verify, but never fully optimal in either direction. That's not inefficiency, that's adaptation under constraint. Meanwhile, the biological condition continues to exist within this framework without needing to be interpreted through traditional threat categories. It is not expanding in a dramatic, visible way. It is interacting, persisting, integrating into system behavior patterns in ways that are only fully visible when multiple data streams are compared over time. And that is part of what makes it so difficult to fully respond to. Because it does not present itself as a single unified problem. It presents itself as a distributed set of effects. And distributed effects are much harder to isolate. Inside leadership structures, there is now an implicit understanding that full rollback of conditions is not part of realistic planning anymore. This isn't framed as failure. It is framed as constraint acknowledgement. The system has changed in ways that cannot be undone without introducing new instability that may be worse than the original condition. So the objective shifts again, not reversal, not elimination, but control of propagation velocity. In simpler terms, how fast things change becomes more important than trying to stop change entirely. That is a very different kind of containment philosophy. At ground level, personnel begin to operate with that understanding, even if it is not explicitly stated in every directive. They start thinking in terms of containment durability rather than containment perfection. How long a zone can remain functional under partial compromise, how long a system can continue operating before degradation reaches unacceptable levels. Time becomes the primary currency again, but now in a different way. Not time to resolution, but time to degradation. And that reframing is psychologically significant, because it replaces the expectation of an endpoint with the expectation of endurance. There is also a growing awareness that every intervention now has dual outcomes, one immediate, one systemic. A successful localized containment action might stabilize a zone, but it may also shift pressure elsewhere in the network. A shutdown might prevent immediate exposure but create downstream uncertainty in systems that depend on that link. So every action becomes a trade between visible stability and hidden instability. And those trade-offs are no longer avoidable. At the system level, this creates a condition where perfect optimization is impossible. The best possible outcome is no longer full control, but acceptable equilibrium under known instability. An equilibrium under instability is inherently temporary, which means the system is now managing not a problem with a solution, but a dynamic condition that requires continuous adjustment. That's where the story settles into its most important realization, not that something escaped, not that containment failed, but that the system itself has been redefined by prolonged interaction with a condition it cannot fully separate from anymore. And once that redefinition is complete, everything that follows exists inside that new framework, where control is no longer absolute, stability is no longer permanent, and containment is no longer an endpoint, but an ongoing process of managing a reality that has already fundamentally changed its shape. And this is where the situation becomes something even more difficult to articulate, because nothing visibly breaks anymore. There's no dramatic collapse, no singular failure point that forces everyone to stop and acknowledge a turning moment. Instead, everything keeps working, just differently. Systems respond, teams execute, reports are filed, decisions are made. From the outside, it can even look stable, functional, organized, under control. But inside that apparent stability, something has quietly shifted from control to accommodation. And that distinction is the final irreversible transition, because once a system begins accommodating a condition instead of trying to eliminate it, it has, in a very real sense, accepted that the condition is now part of its operating reality, not temporarily, indefinitely. You can see this most clearly in how risk is now calculated. Earlier, risk assessments were about identifying and reducing unknowns. Now, they are about living within them. Unknowns are no longer treated as gaps to be closed. They are treated as constants to be managed. That changes the entire logic of decision-making. You're no longer trying to create certainty. You're trying to function despite its absence. Inside containment architecture, this manifests as something close to equilibrium engineering. Systems are no longer optimized for maximum isolation. They are optimized for balance, absorbing fluctuations, redistributing stress, preventing any single point from becoming overwhelmed, even if multiple points are partially compromised. It's less like building a wall, more like managing pressure across a network of interconnected surfaces. And pressure, by definition, never disappears. It only shifts. At the operational level, personnel have now fully internalized this, even if no directive explicitly states it. There's less expectation of fixing anything in a permanent sense. Instead, actions are evaluated based on how effectively they maintain system coherence over time. Coherence becomes the real objective, because once coherence is lost, fragmentation follows. And fragmentation, in a system already operating under distributed instability, is the one outcome that cannot be easily contained. That's why so much emphasis is now placed on communication integrity, even more than physical containment in some cases. Not because communication can stop the biological condition, but because it is the only mechanism left that can keep the human response system functioning as a unified structure. Without that, everything else unravels faster. Meanwhile, the condition itself, whatever its original classification, has fully transitioned into what can only be described as a persistent environmental variable. It doesn't need to expand aggressively anymore. It doesn't need to break out. It is already present in enough of the system's operational pathways that its influence is continuous rather than episodic. That's what makes it so difficult to define. It is not contained in the traditional sense, but it is not uncontrolled either. It exists in a state of managed coexistence, and coexistence is a far more complex state than containment ever was. Because coexistence requires constant negotiation, not between two conscious sides, but between system behaviors, response patterns, environmental conditions, and the evolving interactions between them. At higher coordination levels, there is now a quiet but widespread understanding that the system has crossed a threshold that cannot be uncrossed. This is no longer about preventing a worst-case scenario. This is the scenario now, just not in the form anyone originally expected. Instead of a catastrophic spike followed by resolution, what emerged is a sustained alteration of system behavior, one that continues indefinitely, adapting as it goes, resisting simplification, resisting closure, and that forces a final shift in perspective. The goal is no longer to end the situation. The goal is to prevent it from becoming something worse. That's a narrower objective, but also a heavier one. Because it has no natural endpoint, it requires continuous vigilance without the promise of eventual release from that vigilance. At the human level, that creates a kind of quiet endurance mindset. Not panic, not urgency in the traditional sense, something steadier, more restrained, but also more taxing over time. Because sustaining attention, sustaining coordination, sustaining controlled response under conditions that never fully resolve, that is a different kind of challenge than responding to a finite crisis, and it doesn't come with the same psychological rewards. There's no clear moment of victory, no definitive confirmation that the system has returned to normal. Only the ongoing confirmation that it hasn't gotten worse, and in this new framework, that is what success looks like. Not resolution, not restoration, but continuity. Maintained, carefully, under conditions that are no longer temporary, no longer external, and no longer fully separable from the system itself. That's where everything finally settles, not into an ending, but into a state that continues forward indefinitely, sustained by constant adjustment, quiet resilience, and the understanding that the line between containment and coexistence has already been crossed and cannot be drawn the same way again. And once that line is crossed, once coexistence quietly replaces containment as the real operating condition, something else begins to change. Not in the system, in how the system is understood by the people inside it. Because up until now, even with all the adaptation, all the recalibration, there was still an underlying assumption holding everything together, that this was a problem being managed. But that assumption doesn't hold forever. At some point, the framing itself starts to feel incomplete. Not wrong, just insufficient. Because what's happening no longer fits cleanly into the category of problem. Problems imply solutions, even if those solutions are distant or complex. What exists now doesn't behave like that. It behaves more like a condition of reality within which the system operates, and when that shift fully settles in, it changes something subtle but fundamental. Effort is no longer directed at changing the condition. It's directed at functioning within it as effectively as possible. That sounds similar to what was already happening, but the intent is different. Before, adaptation was a temporary strategy in service of eventual resolution. Now, adaptation becomes the objective itself, and once adaptation becomes the objective, the system begins optimizing for very different things. Not elimination of instability, but sustainability of response. Not restoration of original structure, but resilience of current structure, even if that structure is imperfect. Inside operational layers, This shows up in long-term planning models that would have seemed almost unthinkable earlier on. Instead of designing for recovery timelines, they design for indefinite operation under fluctuating instability. Infrastructure upgrades are no longer aimed at returning to baseline. They're aimed at increasing tolerance for ongoing deviation. Even training protocols begin to change. New personnel are no longer trained on how to resolve scenarios like this. They're trained on how to live inside them, how to interpret partial data without overcommitting, how to act decisively without full certainty, how to maintain coordination even when different parts of the system are experiencing different versions of reality at the same time. Because that's what the system has become, not a single, unified state, but a collection of overlapping states, all managed simultaneously. At higher levels, strategy shifts in a way that's almost philosophical, even if it's never described that way. The idea of control becomes less about dominance over conditions and more about influence within them. You don't control the system completely anymore. You influence its direction. You shape its boundaries, you limit its extremes, but you don't define it outright. And that's a very different relationship between system and operator than what existed at the beginning. Meanwhile, the condition itself continues without needing to escalate or retreat. It simply persists, interacting with whatever structure surrounds it, adapting where necessary, stabilizing where possible, and remaining indifferent to the human need for categorization or closure. It doesn't win, but it doesn't lose either. It becomes part of the system's ongoing state, and that's where the final, quiet realization settles in. This was never going to end the way they expected. Not with a breakthrough, not with a definitive containment success, but with a gradual, almost imperceptible transition into a new normal that doesn't announce itself as new. It just becomes the only reality left to operate within. And in that reality, the question is no longer, how do we stop this? It becomes something much more grounded and much more difficult to answer. How do we continue? Not for a day, not until resolution, but indefinitely. How do you maintain coherence, coordination, and functionality in a system that has permanently incorporated instability into its structure? How do you prevent slow drift into fragmentation when there is no longer a fixed reference point to return to? How do you sustain a response to something that is no longer a temporary disruption, but an ongoing condition? Those are not questions with clean answers. They are questions that have to be lived continuously. And that's where everything ultimately arrives. Not at a conclusion, not at a resolution, but at a steady, ongoing negotiation with a reality that has already changed and will continue to change, whether the system is ready for it or not.